on the 52nd floor of Pierce Global Technologies, inside a glass-walled conference room where decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars were made before most people finished their morning coffee, no one paid attention to the man sitting quietly at the far end of the long mahogany table. He wore no tailored suit, carried no leather portfolio, and offered no introduction, while the room hummed with the practiced confidence of executives who had long decided they were the only people worth noticing. He sat with his hands folded, and his expression completely still, watching, not performing, not signaling, just watching with the kind of patience that only belongs to people who have learned, at some cost, that words are better saved for when they truly matter. The young CEO spotted him from across the room, frowned, and made a quiet calculation that took less than 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, she decided everything she needed to know about him. She turned to the security officer near the door and said, in a voice that carried without effort across every corner of the room, "Security, please escort him out. He is not on the list." The room went utterly silent. Then the door opened. Harrison Pierce stepped inside the man who had built this company from nothing. From a rented one-room office in a forgotten office park, and a single salvage server rack that had cost him 3 months of savings. He did not look at the board of directors. He did not acknowledge the visiting partners or the senior leadership team arranged along the walls. His eyes moved deliberately to the man at the far end of the table, and something unmistakable and quiet crossed his otherwise unreadable face. He reached back and pulled out the empty chair beside him, and when he spoke, his voice was low and certain and completely unbothered by every pair of eyes watching. "Come here, son," he said. "Sit next to me." Not a single person in that room breathed. "Stay until the end, because the truth about who this man really is will change the way you see every quiet person you have ever underestimated." His name was Adrien Cole, and he was 28 years old, though most mornings he felt closer to 40. He had taken the systems engineer position at Pierce Global 3 years ago without fanfare and without any particular plan to rise through the ranks, because rising through the ranks had stopped being the thing he cared most about the moment his son Liam was born. Liam was 6 now, gap-toothed and loud, and completely certain that his father was the greatest person alive, and Adrien had built his entire daily life around that certainty, treating it as a kind of quiet compass that kept him oriented when nothing else did. He packed Liam's lunch before 6 in the morning, drove him to school before driving himself to the 42nd floor, where his small desk sat beside a window that looked out over the east side of the city, and he did not mention any of this at work because it was not the kind of thing you mentioned at work when you were a mid-level systems engineer in a building where what you carried defined what people thought you were worth. He was, by nearly every metric his company used to evaluate people, invisible. He had no seat at the leadership table, no invitation to the strategy sessions on the upper floors, no title that made people straighten slightly when they heard it. His badge opened the same doors as everyone else's. His office chair was the standard issue model that occupied every other desk in his row, and the only thing that made his workspace identifiably his were 2 photographs, one of Liam asleep with a toy rocket clenched in his fist, and one of the 2 of them at a baseball game, both squinting into the same afternoon sun. His manager, a man named Derek Holloway who served as the company's vice president of technology operations, had once described Adrien in a performance review as competent but not leadership material, which was a phrase that revealed far more about Derek Holloway than it did about Adrien Cole. What it really meant was that Adrien refused to perform. He did not talk loudly in the hallways, did not insert himself into conversations to seem more engaged, did not send the kind of emails designed to create a paper trail of visibility. He simply worked, and when he found something wrong, he said so clearly. Which was, to a man like Derek, the most inconvenient thing an employee could do. Alexandra Pierce was 27 years old and had been the CEO of Pierce Global Technologies for exactly 11 months when the morning of the conference began. She was Harrison Pierce's only daughter, and she had spent a significant portion of her life understanding what that meant and what it demanded of her. She had studied economics at Georgetown, completed a joint MBA and technology policy degree at MIT, and had joined the company's strategy division at 24, moving through it at a pace that surprised even the people who were inclined to be skeptical. She was genuinely intelligent. That part was not a story her father had constructed for her benefit. It was simply true. She had a way of reading a financial model that was almost instinctive, could locate the fault line in a business plan in the time it took most people to read the executive summary, and brought to her presentations a level of precision that her team both respected and quietly feared. What she lacked, what 11 months of holding the title had not yet fully given her, was the kind of knowledge that only comes from having been wrong enough times to understand what being wrong actually feels like from the inside. Harrison Pierce was 62, and he had officially stepped back from the daily operations of Pierce Global Technologies 4 years ago, in a leadership transition that the business press had covered extensively and admiringly. What the business press had not covered because Harrison Pierce had arranged it that way was that stepping back and letting go were not the same thing. He still held a controlling interest in the company, still read every quarterly report the week it was produced, and still, with the consistency of a habit formed over 3 decades, watched. He had spent 4 decades learning that the most important information in any organization rarely surfaces in formal meetings. It lives in the margins, in the work of the people no one else is watching, in the quiet warnings that never make it into the polished briefings on the 52nd floor. Adrien had first noticed the anomaly in the financial modeling system 7 weeks before the morning of the conference. And he had noticed it the way he noticed most things, not through any dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of small details that refused to add up correctly. He had been running a routine diagnostic on the company's internal pricing infrastructure when a pattern emerged in the data that should not have been there. A recursive loop in the valuation algorithm that, under certain conditions, caused the model to compound an error rather than self-correct. In isolation, the error was small enough to dismiss as rounding noise, but the company was not operating in isolation. It was 3 months deep into preparation for one of the largest partnership agreements in its history, a deal that would integrate Pierce Global's pricing systems directly into its partner's financial operations, and if the error survived into that integration, it would not stay small for long. He wrote it up the same afternoon he found it. The report was 11 pages, technically precise, and included 3 separate modeling scenarios demonstrating the potential financial exposure under different market conditions. He sent it to Derek Holloway and received no response. 1 week later, he sent a follow-up, and the response he received was 4 sentences long and concluded with the observation that the analysis likely overstates the risk based on assumptions that don't reflect current operational parameters, which was a technically formatted way of saying that Derek had not read it. Adrien sent a revised version 2 weeks after that, shorter and with a clearer executive summary, addressed directly to the Senior Director of Financial Systems with copies to 2 department heads. That email was acknowledged with a read receipt and nothing else. Derek Holloway had been at Pierce Global for 9 years. He was 44 years old, possessed of a very tidy desk and a very large appetite for managing perception, and had cultivated with considerable patience and skill a reputation as someone who ran a tight operation. His team had low turnover and strong performance reviews, which was partly genuine management competence and partly his talent for attributing successes upward and failures downward, as each situation required. When Adrien's first report had arrived, Derek had read enough of it to understand that it was not a small complaint and not an easy fix, and he had made the kind of decision that people in his position made more often than anyone in those positions ever admitted. He decided the timing was wrong. The deal was too close. The pressure was too high, and surfacing a system-level flaw 3 months before signing would invite exactly the kind of scrutiny that Derek's operation could not survive cleanly. He told himself it was a judgment call. He told himself the risk was overstated. He filed the report in a folder he marked low priority and did not open again. Alexandra knew none of this, because she received briefings from her senior team every Monday morning And those briefings were curated as all briefings are by the people delivering them. Derek's Monday updates on technology operations were consistently confident, consistently organized, and consistently focused on forward momentum. Targets hit, systems stable, partnership timeline on track. And she had 100 other competing demands on her attention. She was managing the deal's external narrative, preparing the press strategy, meeting with the partner's executive team, running integration projections, and she trusted her VP of technology, the way any CEO trusts a VP who has been in the building 9 years and has never given visible cause for alarm. That trust, placed not in evidence but in the absence of visible failure, was its own kind of blindness, and it was one she would not fully recognize until it nearly cost her everything. Adrien did not share his frustration with colleagues, because frustration was not especially useful. He kept his desk tidy, kept his head down, drove Liam to school every morning, and came home to make dinner and help with homework and put his son to bed. Some nights he sat at the kitchen table and ran the numbers again, not because he expected anyone to listen, but because the numbers were still wrong, and he was still the one who could see it. The partnership agreement was scheduled to be signed in 48 hours, $200 million, spread across a 5-year integration agreement that would make Pierce Global the exclusive pricing infrastructure provider for one of the largest financial technology firms on the East Coast. The press release had already been drafted, the champagne discreetly ordered, and Alexandra had given an internal address the previous week, describing the deal as a defining moment, not just for the company's valuation, but for its position in the industry's future. The energy in the building was the kind of tight, forward-leaning energy that arrives just before something large and irreversible is set into motion, and no one in the building was more aware of it than the man on the 42nd floor who knew the foundation was cracked. Adrien had spent the previous 72 hours running every variation of the scenario he could construct. The error was not theoretical anymore. He had obtained the specific data set that the partner's integration team had submitted as their operational baseline for the valuation model, and when he ran it through Pierce Global's pricing system, the system with the unaddressed recursive loop, the output was wrong by a margin that was not rounding error. It was structural. Over the 5-year contract term, the discrepancy would translate to a loss of somewhere between $60 and $90 million to Pierce Global, depending on how the market moved. He had calculated this 4 separate times across 4 separate evenings. The number did not change. He sent one final email the morning of the conference. He addressed it directly to Alexandra Pierce, marked it urgent, included a 1-page summary and the full analysis as an attachment. He received an automated response informing him that the CEO's inbox was managed by her executive assistant and that non-scheduled communications from internal staff would be reviewed within 5 to 7 business days. He called the front desk of the executive floor and was told the CEO was in back-to-back preparation sessions for the signing and was not available for unscheduled requests. He tried Derek Holloway's extension once more and was told by Derek's assistant that Mr. Holloway was also unavailable. He sat at his desk for 6 minutes. He looked at the photograph of Liam with the toy rocket. He looked at the one of the two of them squinting into the sun at the baseball game. He thought about what kind of man he wanted to be when Liam was old enough to ask him about the choices he had made. Not the obvious choices with obvious answers, but the small, difficult ones, the ones where silence was easy and speaking was expensive. Then he picked up his access badge and walked to the elevator. The conference room on the 52nd floor was restricted access, and his badge, as expected, did not open the door. He stood outside for a moment, and then a member of the catering team came through with a service cart, and Adrien held the door for them and walked in with the kind of quiet certainty that is, in most buildings, indistinguishable from permission. He chose a chair near the far end of the table, opened his laptop, and waited. The room had been arranged with the care that rooms are arranged when important people are expected. The long mahogany table held water glasses and leather-bound agenda folders at each seat, and the chairs along its length were occupied by the kind of people who had, over many years, learned to wear authority as naturally as clothing. The senior leadership of Pierce Global Technologies was present in full heads of finance, legal, product, operations, and strategy, each accompanied by at least one deputy, arranged with a spatial logic that communicated hierarchy to anyone who knew how to read it. The partner company's delegation had arrived, 6 people in dark suits and deliberate expressions, seated across from the Pierce Global team, with the careful neutrality of people who understood they were also being assessed. Derek Holloway sat to the left of the empty chair at the head of the table, positioned precisely as a person positions himself when he intends to be proximate to the power in the room. Alexandra Pierce entered 3 minutes before the scheduled start time, which was the kind of punctuality that communicates control rather than eagerness. She wore a charcoal jacket over a white shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a way that was severe without being unfriendly, and she moved through the room with the practiced economy of someone who had spent years studying how to carry herself in rooms like this one. She shook hands with the partner delegation, exchanged a few words with each of her senior directors, and took her seat at the head of the table. She glanced at her agenda folder. She looked up, and then her gaze traveled, as it always did when she entered a room, across every occupant, cataloging, sorting, assigning weight and category to each face in the time it takes most people to simply look around. She saw him near the far end of the table, a man in a plain dark jacket that was not quite a suit jacket. No tie, no name card in front of him, no folder open before him. He was sitting with his laptop and his expression entirely composed, and he looked from where she stood like someone who had ended up in the wrong room. He did not look at her when she looked at him. He was reading something on his screen with the focused patience of a man who had been waiting for a while and expected to wait a little longer. She leaned toward the assistant seated behind her and said quietly, "Who is that?" The assistant checked the attendee list, checked it again, and shook her head slightly. Alexandra set down her agenda folder, looked at the security officer stationed near the door, and said clearly enough for the relevant people to hear security, "Could you please escort that gentleman out? He is not on our attendee list." The security officer began to move. Every head at the table turned. Not all at once, but in the sequential way that heads turn when something unexpected interrupts a predictable routine. A few of the junior members of the Pierce Global team exchanged glances. One member of the partner delegation looked at his colleague with an expression that was carefully blank. Derek Holloway looked at his water glass. Adrien Cole, at the far end of the table, closed his laptop slowly. He did not stand. He did not look startled, angry, embarrassed, or defiant. He simply looked at Alexandra Pierce with a steadiness that was, if anything, more unsettling than any of the dramatic responses the room had braced itself to witness. The look of a person who understands a situation completely and is simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. The security officer reached him, said something quietly, and Adrien nodded once, as if agreeing with a perfectly reasonable assessment of an unremarkable situation, and began to push back his chair. The moment had the quality of a breath held for slightly too long, and then the door opened. The change in the room was not loud. It did not arrive with announcement or theater. It arrived the way significant things often arrive, as a shift in the quality of the air, a barely perceptible realignment of attention, the way a room of people adjusts when the center of gravity changes, before anyone consciously registers why. Harrison Pierce did not need to introduce himself. He had not needed to introduce himself inside this building for 31 years, and the 4 years since his official retirement had not meaningfully changed that. He was 62 years old, lean and unhurried, dressed in a dark gray jacket and no tie, and he moved into the room with the ease of a man who had never once confused authority with volume. He said hello to no one. He did not smile broadly or make the kind of entrance designed to signal that his presence was a gift. He simply walked in, and the room rearranged itself around him without being asked. Alexandra looked up. She had known her father was expected to attend in his observer capacity, but she had not expected him at this particular moment, and his timing, as it so often was, felt pointed. Harrison did not look at his daughter first. He looked at the room, taking it in with the slow and comprehensive attention of someone who has learned to read rooms the way other people read text, extracting meaning from position and posture, and the small involuntary adjustments people make when they are uncertain. He completed his survey, and then his gaze stopped. It stopped at the far end of the table, where Adrien Cole was in the process of being escorted out by a security officer who was doing his job correctly and had absolutely no idea what he was doing. Something moved across Harrison's face, not shock, but the opposite of shock, the expression of a man who has anticipated a scene and arrived to find it playing out with a precision that is almost satisfying and almost not. He raised one hand, a small and unhurried gesture directed at the security officer. The officer stopped. Harrison walked the length of the conference room. He walked past the partner delegation, past his daughter, past Derek Holloway, and every other senior executive arranged around that table, and he walked all the way to the far end where Adrien sat very still. Harrison reached past him and pulled out the empty chair beside him, not beside the head of the table, not beside any particular seat of power, just right there at the end where Adrien was. He set his hand briefly on Adrien's shoulder, and he said, in a voice that was quiet enough to be private and clear enough to be heard by everyone present, "Come here, son. What are you doing all the way down here? Sit next to me." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Adrien rose from his chair without rushing, without any visible expression of relief or vindication, and moved to the seat Harrison had pulled out. He sat down. He opened his laptop again. Harrison took the chair beside him, leaned back slightly, and looked toward the head of the table, where Alexandra Pierce sat with an expression that was, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, entirely unguarded. She did not understand what had just happened. That was visible. She was intelligent enough and honest enough with herself to recognize immediately that she had made an error. But the shape of the error was not yet clear to her, and she was sitting at the head of a conference table in front of her father, her entire leadership team, and a visiting delegation. And the space between not understanding and having to act as though she did was exactly 1 second wide. She maintained her composure. Harrison met her gaze briefly, not with reproach, not with anything punishing, and then he looked at Adrien and said, with the measured tone of someone introducing a fundamental fact, "Let's hear from him." The 6 people from the partner delegation exchanged a look that carried several layers of revised assessment. Derek Holloway's expression had, over the past 90 seconds, moved through a rapid and private sequence of calculations. Clara Whitman, the senior finance director who had worked at Pierce Global for 12 years and had developed a reliable instinct for knowing when something was about to change, quietly put down her pen. Adrien looked at his screen, then looked up at the room, then looked briefly, directly at Alexandra. Not with triumph, not with score settling. With the same straightforward attention he would have given any problem he was about to explain. He said, "Thank you. I need about 10 minutes of your time, and then you can decide what to do with it." It was the first thing he had said in that room. Harrison Pierce let the silence sit for one more moment before he spoke. He was not a man who enjoyed the performance of revelation. He had watched too many people use the moment of disclosure as an opportunity to center themselves rather than the information. And so what he said was brief, factual, and delivered without ceremony. "Some of you may not know Adrien by name," he said, looking around the table with the calm precision of someone who has already decided what he thinks of everyone present. "That is, I suspect, more your loss than his." He said that Adrien Cole had joined Pierce Global Technologies 3 years ago as a mid-level systems engineer. He said it without apology and without the narrative framing designed to make an audience feel clever for wading through it. Then he continued. 22 years ago, Harrison said, when Pierce Global Technologies was not a Fortune 500 company, but a 12-person startup operating out of a building that had previously housed a dry cleaning service, a then 19-year-old programmer named Adrien Cole had been brought in through a university technical outreach program to help rebuild the company's core data processing architecture. He had been paid modestly, asked for nothing beyond the work itself, and had, over the course of 14 months, designed the foundational logic framework on which Pierce Global's entire systems infrastructure was still, at its base, constructed. He had declined a full-time senior role when it was offered, because his mother was ill, and his circumstances at home were complicated, and he was not, at 19, in a position to commit to what the role would require. He had left on good terms. Harrison had kept his number. When Adrien had reached out 7 years later after the loss of his wife, after the years of rebuilding a life that now included a small son, who needed stability above everything else, and asked whether there was any work available, Harrison had thought carefully about what that meant and had made a deliberate decision. He did not offer Adrien his old position. He did not offer recognition or title, or the kind of formal acknowledgement that would have required explanation and internal politics. He offered him an ordinary systems engineering role, at ordinary compensation, at the level that would allow him to work quietly and be present for his son, and simply be himself inside this building. He had asked Adrien directly whether he understood what that meant, in a private conversation no one else heard. And Adrien had said that he did, and that it was exactly what he needed. "What I did not tell him," Harrison said, looking now at the middle distance with the candor of a man choosing his words from something real rather than rehearsed, "was that I also needed him here, because this company, after 3 decades, has far more management than it has people who actually understand what is underneath it." He did not look at Derek Holloway when he said this. He did not need to. The room held a new kind of quiet, not the breathless silence of the earlier revelation, but the different kind that comes when people are absorbing something that rearranges their frame of reference. The partner delegation was no longer neutral in their expressions. They were paying the specific, sharpened attention of people who have realized they are present at something more significant than a routine signing ceremony. Clara Whitman had uncapped her pen again, this time to write. Alexandra Pierce had not moved. She sat at the head of the table, with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, and she was looking at Adrien with the particular quality of someone who is reviewing a sequence of decisions in real time and finding every one of them wanting. She thought about the unsigned email. She thought about the 5 to 7 business day response window. She thought about Derek's Monday briefings. Consistently confident, consistently organized, consistently offering her the picture of an operation with nothing wrong beneath the surface. She thought about the moment, less than an hour ago, when she had looked at the man at the far end of her table and decided in 2 seconds everything she needed to know about him. She had been wrong in the specific way that intelligent people are wrong, when they mistake the signals of belonging for belonging itself, when they use the visible markers of status as a proxy for the substance underneath, and she had done it with complete confidence and complete efficiency. Adrien looked up from his screen. "I found something in the pricing system," he said. "I have been trying to report it for 7 weeks. I would like to show it to you now, if that is all right." Harrison nodded once. Adrien opened the presentation. The error was not complicated to understand once it was displayed, and that was, in its own way, the most damning thing about it, that it had been sitting there, visible to anyone who looked in the right place, with the right knowledge, for months. Adrien's presentation was precise and unhurried, built on the same framework as the 11-page report that had been filed and ignored 7 weeks earlier, but condensed now into 7 slides that moved from identification to mechanism to projected impact in a sequence that was, by every standard of technical communication, exemplary. He did not speak over anyone's head. He did not perform expertise. He simply explained what he had found and what it meant. The financial pricing model used in the partnership agreement was built on Pierce Global's internal valuation infrastructure, specifically a module that calculated long-term integration costs based on a rolling operational baseline. Somewhere in the last major systems update, A recursion parameter had been incorrectly flagged as a fixed variable. The model was therefore not self-correcting as new data came in. It was compounding its initial assumption. Over a 1-year period, that error was negligible. Over the 5-year term of the proposed partnership agreement, using the specific baseline figures the partner company had submitted, which Adrien displayed on screen, alongside Pierce Global's own output, the discrepancy resolved to a number. The number was $83 million. He let it sit on the screen for a moment without editorializing. He did not say this is a crisis or we cannot sign this contract. He said, if the agreement is executed on the current data, this is the projected exposure to Pierce Global over the contract term under conservative market assumptions. Under moderate assumptions, it is higher. He clicked to the next slide. Under moderate assumptions, the number was 112 million. The room was silent. In the way rooms are silent, when everyone in them is simultaneously doing the same rapid internal arithmetic and arriving at approximately the same conclusion. Robert Carey, the head of finance who had been at Pierce Global for 6 years and had signed off on the deal's financial modeling, looked at the slide for a long time and then looked at Derek Holloway. It was not a complicated look. It was the look of a person trying to determine whether what he was seeing had been visible to the man beside him, and if so, for exactly how long. Derek was looking at the table. He had been looking at the table since the moment Harrison walked to the far end of the room, and he was a man who had spent 9 years building a reputation for tight, reliable operations, watching that reputation disassemble itself in real time. While sitting in a chair he could not leave, Alexandra said, "Derek." Her voice was even, almost entirely even, with only the faintest tightening underneath it that anyone not listening closely would have missed. "Did you receive reports about this?" Derek said. "There were internal communications. I assessed them and determined the risk was within acceptable parameters." He said it with the grammar of a man who was already composing the document he would need to file afterward, the language of plausible judgment, rather than the language of what had actually happened. Alexandra said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Adrien sent you those reports." It was not a question. There were communications. Derek said again. Harrison Pierce had not looked at Derek during any of this. He was looking at his daughter, and his expression was neither hard nor gentle. It was the expression of someone watching a person navigate a genuinely difficult moment and choosing not to intervene, because the navigation is the point. Thomas Burke, the lead representative from the partner delegation, a man who had spent 20 years in financial technology and had seen more than his share of last-minute discoveries, leaned forward and said, "Can this be corrected?" His voice was professional and steady, but there was something in his posture that communicated the thing none of them wanted to name, that they had nearly signed a $200 million agreement built on a broken foundation, and that the two words nearly and signed were separated by about 30 minutes. Adrien said, "Yes." He looked at Thomas Burke with the directness he brought to everything. "It will take a few hours to patch the model and validate the output against your baseline data. If you are willing to hold the signing until tomorrow morning, I can have clean figures to you tonight." Thomas looked at his delegation. Then he looked at Harrison Pierce, who had not moved and whose expression communicated nothing except that he had been in rooms like this before, and they tended to resolve the way they needed to resolve. Thomas nodded. "Tomorrow morning," he said. Alexandra looked at Derek Holloway. She said, quietly but without any softness in it, "We will continue this conversation separately." Then she looked at Adrien, held his gaze for a moment, and said, "Thank you." And then, because she was precise in her language, and because it mattered that it be said correctly, "I am sorry for earlier." Adrien looked at her. He said, "Let us fix the system first." He turned back to his laptop. The meeting adjourned 20 minutes later, with the partner delegation escorted to a waiting room on the floor below, and the Pierce Global leadership team left in a configuration no one had anticipated at the start of the morning. Derek Holloway left the room before anyone could direct a question at him that he could not deflect with procedural language, which was itself a kind of answer. Clara Whitman stayed. Robert Carey stayed. Most of the senior team stayed because they had been in organizations long enough to understand that the moment after a near catastrophe is also a moment of information, and information in buildings like this one was always worth gathering. Alexandra Pierce stood at the head of the table for a moment, after the room had rearranged itself around her. She was still holding herself the way she always held herself in professional settings, upright, composed, deliberate, but something had changed in the quality of it. It looked less like confidence now, and more like the effort of maintaining composure, when composure is not the most natural thing available. She had been running this company for 11 months, had moved through every one of those months with the specific intensity of someone trying to prove they belong in a room, and the way she had chosen to prove it through rigor, preparation, the cultivation of strong operational teams, the relentless performance of competence, had not been wrong. It had simply been incomplete. It had left a gap between what she knew and what was happening underneath what she knew, and someone quiet and ordinary-looking had been standing in that gap for 7 weeks, trying to get her attention. She walked to the far end of the table where Adrien was already working, his laptop open, his expression focused entirely on what was in front of him. He had not, after she apologized, said anything that invited further conversation. He was simply doing the next thing, which was the only thing that had ever genuinely interested him. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. He glanced up briefly. She said, "I have seen your name on briefing lists. I have seen it for 2 years." He nodded. She said, "I did not know who you were." He said, "That was fine." She said, "It was not fine. I made a decision about you in approximately 2 seconds, and it was wrong, and it nearly cost this company a great deal of money and a great deal of credibility." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "The money and credibility were already at risk before today. That part was not your mistake. The mistake was earlier." He said it without sharpness, without the undertone of a lesson being delivered. He said it the way a person states a mechanical fact about a system they understand completely. She asked him why he had not pushed harder. Why, after 3 failed attempts through proper channels, he had not escalated over Derek's head or gone directly to the board. He looked at his screen for a moment before answering. He said, "I did try, but the honest answer is that in organizations like this one, a systems engineer at my level going over a vice president's head without documented authorization looks like exactly one thing to most people, and that thing is not usually courage." He said it without bitterness, which made it, if anything, more worth hearing than if he had. Harrison Pierce had remained in his seat at the far end of the room, through all of this close enough to hear without being part of the conversation, and he watched his daughter lean forward across the table from a man she had tried to have removed from the room less than an hour ago, and he watched her listen. Not listen with the part of her attention already composing a response, but actually listen, the kind of listening that can only happen after a person has been wrong and knows it. There was no classroom for this. No MBA program and no number of mentorship conversations could manufacture it. You could only learn it by sitting across from someone who was right and knowing, without any ambiguity, that you had been wrong. Alexandra said, finally, "What do you need to fix it tonight?" Adrien told her. She wrote it down. She stood up and went to arrange it. Adrien worked for 4 hours and 37 minutes without a break longer than the time it took to refill a glass of water. Clara Whitman sat across from him for 2 of those hours, not because she had been assigned to, but because she had arrived with 45 minutes of questions that turned into 90 minutes of answers, that turned into a conversation about systems architecture, that was, by any honest measure, the most substantive technical exchange she had participated in since joining the company. Robert Carey came and went, consulting on the financial modeling parameters and flagging 3 additional areas of potential exposure that Adrien's broader audit had surfaced. The accounting was not comfortable. It would require disclosure, adjustment, and a board conversation that no one was looking forward to having. But it was contained. That was the word Robert used, twice, with visible relief. The corrected model was ready by 10:47 that evening. Adrien ran it against every variable scenario he had developed over the previous weeks, cross-referenced it against the partner company's baseline data, and produced a clean output showing the actual 5-year cost integration under conservative, moderate, and adverse market conditions. The numbers were different from the original contract figures. In the partner company's favor, they were more accurate, and therefore more sustainable, as the foundation of a genuine long-term agreement. Thomas Burke reviewed them remotely that night, and responded at 11:30 with 2 sentences. The revised figures were acceptable, and his delegation would arrive at 9 the following morning. Alexandra presented the revised terms at the signing. She stood at the same head of the same table, and delivered the revisions in precise, clear language that neither minimized what had happened nor dramatized it. She described it as a modeling correction, identified during final pre-signature review, attributed it to internal technical analysis, and moved forward. Thomas Burke, who knew exactly what had happened and was choosing not to make it into more than it needed to be, signed the agreement. Alexandra signed. Hands were shaken. The deal was done, built now on a foundation that would actually hold. Afterward, Harrison Pierce spoke briefly to the assembled leadership. He thanked them for their professionalism. He noted, without elaboration, that the company would be conducting a full internal systems audit over the following quarter, led by the technology team. He said that the audit would be supervised by Adrien Cole, and that for the duration of the project, Adrien's reporting line would run directly to the CEO's office. He said this in the same tone. He said everything flat, final, without performance, and the room received it the only way it could, without objection. Derek Holloway was not present for the announcement. He had submitted a letter to Human Resources that morning. Adrien was standing near the window when Harrison told him about the new structure. He looked out at the east side of the city for a moment and said, "I want to be clear that I am not interested in a title." Harrison said he understood. Adrien said, "I need to be done by 5:30 every day." Harrison said, "I know." There was a pause, and then Adrien said, "Liam has a baseball game on Thursday." Harrison said, "I would like to come, if that is all right." Adrien looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded and went back to his desk. Alexandra found him there an hour later, going through the preliminary audit scope with the quiet focus of a man who has never needed a crowd to know what he is doing. She had a folder and a different quality in her bearing than the one she had carried into the conference room at 9 that morning. Not smaller exactly, but more grounded, as if something that had been tensed in her for a long time had been allowed, at last, to release. She said she wanted to review the audit scope together. He looked up and said, "All right." She sat down across from him, opened the folder, and they began. 3 months after the morning of the conference, Pierce Global Technologies completed a staged rollout of the corrected pricing infrastructure across all its operational divisions. The rollout was methodical, fully documented, and executed without a single critical incident, which was itself a kind of accomplishment, given the scale of what was being touched and the number of dependencies involved. The internal audit that Adrien led identified 11 additional areas of exposure in the company's data architecture. None as severe as the original pricing model error, but each one significant enough to require correction. The report he submitted at the end of the quarter was 114 pages. Alexandra read all of it. She kept her annotations in a separate document that grew, over those 3 months, to 26 pages of her own observations, questions, and commitments written in handwriting that her executive assistant later described as unusually careful. The relationship between Adrien and Alexandra was not what it had been in those first 11 months, and by the time the audit was complete, that was obvious to everyone who shared a room with them, which was more frequent now, and no longer surprising to anyone. It was not a warm relationship in the way warmth is performed, not full of the small signals people use to advertise closeness. It was something more structural, a working relationship built on the specific kind of trust that is earned rather than assumed, forged in the experience of having been in a genuinely difficult room together and both choosing, at the moment it mattered most, to focus on the problem rather than themselves. Alexandra had stopped assuming she already possessed the most important information in any briefing. She had started asking her teams a different question, not "Is everything on track?" but "What are you not certain about?" And the answers she received were considerably more useful than the ones she had been getting before. It was a small change in language, and a substantial change in what the organization was willing to show her. Adrien's daily life changed less than people expected, because people expected the change to arrive in the form of a better office and a title on a door. Neither materialized, because neither had been what this was about. He worked at the same desk with the same 2 photographs, arrived before most people, and left at 5:20 to pick up Liam from his after-school program. He attended 2 board meetings over those 3 months, both at Harrison's request, and in both of them he said approximately the same number of words. He always said few, direct, and useful. Liam started a new chapter book about a boy who builds his own rocket ship, and Adrien read 4 pages of it aloud every night before bed, which was the thing Liam had decided was non-negotiable, and which Adrien had decided was the best part of every day, without exception. The baseball game on Thursday, the one Harrison had asked about in that brief exchange by the window, was a 4-2 win for Liam's team, during which Liam scored 1 run by virtue of being walked and sprinting to second base before the opposing team had time to react. Harrison Pierce, who had spent 31 years in boardrooms and had been present at every major signing and acquisition in his company's history, sat in an aluminum bleacher seat with a paper cup of coffee and watched the game with an expression of uncomplicated satisfaction. He and Adrien said very little to each other during the game, which was entirely fine. They had learned, between them, that the most important things rarely required saying. There is a particular kind of error that even intelligent people make repeatedly, and it has nothing to do with missing information. The information, most of the time, is present. It is in the room, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, wearing an ordinary jacket and making no noise. The error is in the filter in the habit, carefully cultivated and rarely examined, of reading status for substance, appearance for capability, silence for absence. It is the error that mistakes the performance of importance for importance itself, and it is almost always expensive, in one way or another, eventually. The organizations that catch it early are the ones where someone has the honesty to sit down across from a person they misjudged and ask the right questions, and then to actually wait for the answers. Adrien Cole did not set out to prove anything to anyone. He had done the work because the work was there, and because he was the one who could see it. He had sat quietly at the far end of that table not to make a point but because that was where the chairs were, and he had gone home to his son every evening, not as a statement about his values, but because his son was 6 years old and needed him there, and being there was the thing he had decided quietly, without announcement, without asking anyone's permission, was the most important work he would ever do. Not everyone who stays silent is waiting to be discovered. Not every ordinary-looking thing is ordinary, and not every seat at the far end of the table belongs to someone who ended up there by accident.